Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're going to continue our History of World War II series and talk about the formation of Task Force 1 following the attack on Pearl Harbor, and also some of the early carrier raids the U.S. Navy launched in the immediate aftermath. If you'd like to learn more about the attack on Pearl Harbor or what happened to Arizona, check out these other videos. So the U.S. Pacific Fleet was devastated and crippled during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The United States immediately had to scramble in order to get defensive forces in order. We pulled back from our outer defenses and allowed the Japanese to take the Philippines, which you could have heard about in our last video about the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron defending the Philippines, and allowed them to take Guam and Wake Island. We weren't sure how far they were going to go, so we pulled back a reserve force around the West Coast and the Pearl Harbor area to protect the mainland United States against a major Japanese attack if they continued to steamroll all the way across the Pacific. Where did we get these ships? Some of them were resurrected from Pearl Harbor, while about half of the battleships at Pearl Harbor were badly damaged. The other half were relatively lightly damaged. So within a couple of months of the war, we were able to repair 4 of the 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor. So by February 1942, these ships had not only been repaired, but they had received anti-aircraft upgrades, such as these 20mm anti-aircraft guns, which had not made it to any of the Pacific Fleet battleships by December of 1941, but were absolutely covering their decks by February of 42. And we were also able to shift battleships from the Atlantic into the Pacific via the Panama Canal. So we were able to switch an entire class of 3 battleships from the Atlantic to the Pacific, one, because we had the Panama Canal, and 2, because there wasn't any significant threat from German or Italian, the other Axis nation, battleships in the Atlantic. So our older battleships, like Texas, New York, and Wyoming, were enough to help with the British battleship fleet to contain the Axis battleships at that time. Also, newer battleships, like New Jersey, when she gets commissioned in 1943, spends a period of time in the Atlantic in case any German battleships come out while she's training. She was not the only battleship to do that. Many of the earlier battleships, like Washington, Alabama, Massachusetts, spent time in the Atlantic before switching over to the Pacific Fleet and joining the fast carrier task forces. So, the Task Force 1 battleships were Colorado. She was a Colorado-class battleship with 8 16-inch guns that was assigned to the Pacific Fleet, but she was at Puget Sound getting work done at the attack on Pearl Harbor. So she was completely undamaged, and they were able to rush through that dry docking and get her into service pretty quickly. Her sister ship, the battleship Maryland, was at Pearl Harbor, moored inboard of Oklahoma. Oklahoma ate 9 torpedoes, but Maryland, because she was inboard, didn't take any. She took 2 bomb hits, which were duds, and she was really quickly repaired and paired up with Colorado to form part of the nucleus of Task Force 1. The battleship Tennessee also survived Pearl Harbor. She was a Tennessee-class battleship with, or a California-class battleship with 12 14-inch guns, very, very similar to the Colorado class. And she was moored inboard of West Virginia. West Virginia ate 7 torpedoes and some bomb hits. Tennessee only took 2 bomb hits and was pretty rapidly repaired. Battleship Pennsylvania was in dry dock at Pearl Harbor, so she couldn't be torpedoed. She did get hit with some bombs, but she was already in dry dock, got repaired, and was able to put back out to sea and join the Task Force 1. Pennsylvania was also armed with 12 14-inch guns. Her sister ship, Arizona could not be repaired. And the older battleships, Nevada and Oklahoma, were also too badly damaged to be repaired. Oklahoma had taken 9 torpedoes and capsized, and Nevada had taken several torpedoes and bomb hits and run aground at Hospital Point. Likewise, Tennessee's sister ship California had been severely damaged and was sunk in the mud, and it would be a couple of years before she rejoined the force, or Colorado and Maryland's sister ship West Virginia. So now you've got from Pearl Harbor, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and from the Pacific Fleet that wasn't at Pearl Harbor, you've got Colorado. From the Atlantic, the 3 New Mexico-class battleships, New Mexico, Idaho, and Mississippi, were all transferred through the Panama Canal to the Pacific. They had all received major work in the 1930s and had 12 14-inch guns. And so these 7 battleships formed the nucleus of America's Pacific Defense Force, which was called Task Force 1. They ate a tremendous amount of oil, so they were not deployed too far away from the United States. Also, we were worried the Japanese would attack the United States, so we kept them close. During this time, they did a tremendous amount of training, and so were probably more efficient, those 7 battleships, by February of 1942, than were the 8 battleships that were lost in Pearl Harbor as a group. So within just 2 or 3 months of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we had rebuilt our Pacific battleship force. But we hadn't deployed it yet. Instead of risking the battleships, which it takes 4 years to build a new battleship to replace them, we were sending out carrier task forces. The carriers were escorted by fast cruisers and destroyers. They had speed to get in and out. They had significant anti-aircraft guns already on board, and the aircraft carriers had combat air patrols, fighter planes to protect them from enemy aircraft. The cruisers were all built in the interwar period and were nicknamed tinclads because they were on the light side, and the destroyers are really easy to repair. So these are ships that we were throwing against the Japanese from pretty much as soon as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor until we get into the major battles of Coral Sea and Midway, which we'll talk about in a future video. The United States started World War II with 8 aircraft carriers. Unlike the Japanese, who combined their aircraft carriers for more striking power, the United States dispersed theirs into individual strike groups, so that if a single carrier was found, only one carrier would be damaged or lost. This was a pre-war strategy. This wasn't some strategy that was concocted during the war when they became precious commodities. Of those 8 carriers, only 3 of them started the war in the Pacific: Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise. Thankfully, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, none of them were in port. All of them had been sent out to either get repair work done or to deliver aircraft to some of the far-flung American bases. We're in the officer's lounge on the Battleship New Jersey, and here we have a map of places Battleship New Jersey sailed during World War II. We're going to use this to illustrate some of the places that the aircraft carriers were. So, here, of course, West Coast United States, Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. Up here is Midway. Wake Island was an American possession at this point. That's one of the ones that will be involved. You've got Johnston Atoll over in this area somewhere. American Samoa is down here. So that forms the American line of defense following the Japanese incursions. You've got Samoa to Johnston to Midway to the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese are able to take some of the Aleutian Islands up here, Attu and Kiska. They're able to take Wake and Guam and, of course, the Philippines. And so Japan now has all these rings of island defenses that the U.S. has to punch through to get at them. And we'll cover those in future videos. For now, those three carriers are getting aircraft to these American possessions. These American possessions are going to come under attack immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And one by one, Guam and Wake and the Philippines will fall to the Japanese, and then that will become the end of it. We'll create our line that we're holding, and they'll have their multiple lines of island possessions. In the Atlantic, the other carriers were doing work. They were either working up because they were brand new, they were operating with the British, they were doing neutrality patrols. We weren't in the war yet, so they were trying to keep U-boats away from the 200-mile limit to the U.S. coast, which we claimed as a exclusion zone, a neutral zone. But following the attack on Pearl Harbor, most of these carriers were pretty immediately transferred to the Pacific. So let's go through them real fast. Langley was our first carrier. She was real small and real slow. So by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was just a seaplane tender, and she was being used primarily as an aviation transport. She was with the Asiatic Squadron delivering P-40 Warhawks, and she was sunk by Japanese aircraft pretty early on in the war. Lexington and Saratoga were battle cruisers that had been converted under the Washington Naval Treaty. They were long ships, about the size of an Iowa-class battleship in length and width. They were fast ships, but they only had a single rudder, so they were very slow to maneuver. Poor Saratoga, every time she went out to sea, she ate a torpedo from a Japanese submarine and ended up not participating much. Poor Lexington went to the Coral Sea, which we'll talk about in a future video, and also ate some torpedoes and didn't come back from that. Early in the war, Saratoga was coming back to Pearl Harbor from the mainland. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Wake Island, I believe. She was recalled. Then when Wake Island was attacked by the Japanese, Saratoga was being sent out with a relief force to try and defend the Alamo of the Pacific. But before the fleet got there, Admiral Pye recalled them. Lexington was trying to create a diversion and screen for this relief force by raiding Japanese island possessions, but before she could do that, Admiral Pye recalled her. So she ends up going to the Coral Sea. She does some raids down there, and then she is still in that area during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 42, which we'll get to. Let's see. Next, you have the Yorktown class aircraft carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. Hornet is fairly new. She's working up in the Atlantic, and she will come to the Pacific by April to join Enterprise in the Doolittle raid, which will cause them to miss the Battle of Coral Sea. You have also the smaller carriers, Ranger and Wasp. At this point in the war, because they are smaller and slower, they're left in the Atlantic. So only the other larger carriers are transferred to the Pacific. So Enterprise and Yorktown are the two that are actually doing stuff. And Enterprise was almost back to Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was attacked. She missed being in port by about a day, where she would have probably been sunk if she had been there. So she was under the command of Admiral Halsey. Admiral Halsey immediately took her out in search of the Japanese carriers. He assumed that the Japanese carriers would be coming from the Mandate, the Japanese islands over here. He had no idea that they had sailed along a northern route to attack Pearl Harbor. So he was looking in the wrong direction. Yorktown was in the Atlantic. She gets transferred over. And Enterprise and Yorktown come down here and they raid the Marshall and the Gilbert Islands. Why is this important? They didn't really do much damage to the Japanese, but it was great for American morale back home that we're actually hitting them back. It didn't risk them too much, and most importantly, the American crews have never seen combat. The Japanese have been fighting in China for a decade. Their pilots are extremely well trained and extremely experienced, and they're flying better aircraft. They are better than us. Their tactics are better, their experience is better, their equipment is better. That we committed some of our carriers to these raids early on before we got into full pitched battle gave us time to work on our tactics, learn that Brewster Buffaloes and Devastators were bad aircraft and we needed to replace them with Wildcats and Avengers, and gave our aircrew experience so that they could compete with the Japanese. It was found out that a single battle was enough experience to take you from being green to being a fairly competent aviator. And so you see these ships which have had a single battle under their belt perform tremendously better than ships that haven't. So when we get to Midway, we'll talk about Yorktown, whose crew had the most experience at that point. Her aircraft found the Japanese fleet and did damage. Enterprise's crew that had seen experience during these raids found the Japanese fleet, some of that air crew, and they did damage. Hornets squadrons, which had not been in significant combat yet, by and large did not find the Japanese fleet. The squadron that did find the Japanese fleet was completely destroyed without doing any damage. And some of the aircraft that didn't find the Japanese fleet also didn't find the American fleet, never came home. So a single battle's experience is incredibly important, and that is what we got with our carrier task forces during these raids. So, remember to like, share, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comment section, and we'll try and reply to you. Tune back in the future. Future videos are going to cover some of the early carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway, and then we'll get into the American counterattack down here at Guadalcanal. And thanks for watching today.